What's up, everybody? It is me, Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, here with another installment of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast. Hope you're doing well. Today, I've got a friend and return guest on podcasts of mine. He did an episode on my other podcast, Exhaust, last year on some similar themes. But this is Edgardo Sepulveda. How's it going, Edgardo?
Hi, Emmett. Very pleased to be here on Nuclear Barbarians. I'm a big fan of both of Exhaust and Nuclear Barbarians, so great to be invited and talk to you about some common themes that we're both interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Today we are going to be talking about what is up with Ontario and what is up with Ontario nuclear. As an American, I don't know much about it, but as a North American, I should. So I am stoked to have Edgardo here. So tell me, man, what's up with nuclear in Ontario? Lay it out for me.
Sure. Well, Ontario, so the largest or most populous province in Canada. We're sort of north of New York, and we go all the way up. Population about 15 million, so that kind of puts us into a pretty large, United States state. I think we would be fourth or fifth. I think there's like California, New York, I think Illinois, I think Pennsylvania, and then we'd be fourth or fifth, something like that. So pretty large state, usually sort of the manufacturing core when we used to manufacture stuff in North America.
R.I.P.
a little less so now. And traditionally the sort of the nuclear capital of Canada. Right. We've had nuclear generation in Ontario since the 1960s. This current fleet of reactors dates from 1971. We are probably one of the heaviest in terms of generation mix. We have 60% of our electricity is nuclear. So it's very large. It's kind of like akin to France. It's akin to Slovakia or Hungary. I think maybe Illinois is close to that, but I think in terms of the percentage of electricity that we get from nuclear. But so we're a very nuclear heavy province, but we have some challenges. And the biggest challenge that I wanted to talk to you about was that we are slated for one of those plants to shut down in 2025. And so there's a whole process amongst people who think that nuclear is the way to go because it is safe, it is reliable, it is baseload, and it doesn't have any direct emissions. To try to, fight the good fight, that is often the case for many nuclear advocates around the world, whether it's, Indian Point, it's Diablo Canyon, it's the Save the Six in Germany, is to have this particular nuclear generation station, it's called Pickering, refurbished and saved, and so continue to generate power for another 30 years after 2025. So that's sort of the big thing, and it's, we've got some time. But these things happen, right? Like these things, you have to move, your political pressure and advocacy in order to kind of save these plants. Because in the absence of which, we are going to do, or what is going to happen in Ontario is what has happened in so many other places, is that the minute those plants get switched off, guess what's going to get fired up?
Got that natural gas, baby.
Right. That's exactly it. And we've got a very clean grid as a result of the 60% nuclear. And so, we don't want to go back in time.
Yeah. So okay. You're right. These things happen. This is what's going on. Lay out what are the political players for me, and like who's against, who's in favor, what arguments are people using?
Right. Well, it's the typical ones. There's a couple of differences then, from like an Indian Point or from, the Dresden and Byron in Illinois or Diablo Canyon in California, or the six German plants the six nuclear plants in Germany. And the big difference is that these are the plants that are slated to be shut down are owned and operated by a public power company. Right, so they're not owned by private utilities, the investor-owned utilities, as they're called in the United States. They are owned essentially like the equivalent of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Right, so it's public power. It is the corporation. The authority is called Ontario Power Generation, and it is 100% owned by the province, by the state. And so we don't have to, unlike Indian Point, where it was Entergy, right?
Right.
Or, in Diablo Canyon, where it
PG.
is PG&E. Here, we don't have to deal with persuading a private operator to continue to do something that may or may not be in its commercial interest, or that may or may not be getting pressure from, anti-nuclear advocates to shut down. And where deals are made between the government, as we understand it to be the case in Indian Point, and the private operator to kind of like, oh, I can save one of the two. So the situation is different in terms of who needs to be lobbied, who needs to be persuaded to continue to do that. And that makes it simpler in some sense, but in the same way that people who believe that these plants should be saved and should not be mothballed, there are equally other people who believe that should be in fact the case, and is also lobbying government to do that, right? But ultimately, this is a ministerial decision. It's done by the equivalent of the Secretary of Energy in California, or the Secretary of Energy in New York. It's a decision of the Minister of Energy whether or not ultimately to shut these things down or to authorize that they be refurbished. And in terms of the process, these are reaching their slated 30-year, well, they've actually gone a bit beyond. So they would need to be refurbished, right, in terms of some of the major components that have to be refurbished. This is pretty standard. We already have a very large refurbishment program for some of the other reactors. So it's not as if this is new, but we're trying to persuade the government to be able to refurbish these other ones as well. And rather than having to shut them down. So that's the process. But I also thought that it would be, in the context of, the political debate in the United States about public power. And what does it mean? The idea of, municipalization, the idea of, sort of the ownership of whether it's municipal water or municipal electricity, to go a little bit back in time, Emmett, and so kind of start talking about why is it that we in Ontario, like most of Canada, have public power, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of that, and then compare it in contrast to the public power movement and the regulatory movements of the United States, and how our sectors have developed since way back in time to be able to talk about specifically nuclear. Because one of the things I was crunching the numbers in the United States, you have in the United States, I think, purely public power nuclear stations. I think there's like 8 or 9 out of the 93. There's the 7 or 8 that are owned by the TVA. And then you've got Cooper, owned by the Nebraska co-ops. And then, there's a bunch of them that are sort of, partial ownership. But I crunched the numbers, like in terms of capacity, 18% of all nuclear power is owned by public or cooperative entities in the United States. So that's a very significant. It's certainly higher than renewables, right?
Yeah.
Renewables, it's like probably 1 or 2% of public power, of existing private public power, owns renewables. On the other hand, they're kind of overweight on nuclear, which I think is important, kind of like a factoid. Most people don't know that, and B, it's important as to the theory and versus the practice of actual public power.
Gotcha. So, yeah, I didn't know it was that much nuclear that was public. That's fascinating. So, we'll get into some of the differences here and how this came about. let's talk about Ontario and how it came about in Ontario.
Hmm.
Was Ontario, I'm assuming it was a public power entity before nuclear came onto its grid. So what was it like before nuclear and
Right.
what was it like after?
Sure. Like in the United States and like most other countries in the world, I mean, the original grid was a series of kind of a private entrepreneur, think of Edison, think of some of these other people that made, the pioneers and also made a bunch of money. And so, it was certainly the case in Ontario as well. We had relatively early adoption. I think Toronto, which is the capital city of Ontario and the largest city, I think was the first city in the world to have an electric railway. Like I think it was 1883. It was
Wow.
very, very soon. Yeah, no, it was very soon. But it was all private, right? And it
Mm,
was owned by, the richest men of the city,
hmm.
which is pretty much the case, around the world. And then what they used to do, and this is sort of, what people used to rail against was that these what were later to be called robber barons would get their friends in city government,
Hmm.
and they would get 20-year or 30-year charters, right? and,
Right.
and often there would be kickbacks, right?
Hmm.
And so the politics were dirty at the time. Municipal politics were particularly dirty, and so people were complaining that this fantastic new source of power, electricity, that
Hmm.
could that could light the street, that could run tramways and electric trains, was costing a lot. And it was only in the city center. It was owned by rich industrialists, and the city was in cahoots with it often, like the city politicians. And so, in the context of like the progressive era in the United States and in Canada, kind of like after Reconstruction, but before Second World War, there's just a lot of agitation about this, that people don't
Mm.
like to be fleeced, right? That it
Yeah.
was it was too expensive, it was unreliable, it was focused on, just the rich people having it and industrialists, and they were charging an arm and a leg, right? So
Hmm.
so classic pocketbook economic populism. And out of this, we see in Canada, in Ontario in particular, in New York State, this push for either public power, because people thought that they could do it better rather than private enterprise, or the regulation of private monopolies. So it's out of this that, in as a result of that kind of political agitation, we have an election, provincial election in 1905, which is fought on the idea of public power, right? Like
Mm.
the one that was the election issue, and the new government was voted in overwhelmingly, and so immediately in the following year they establish what would become the largest electricity company at the time in the world, which was called the Hydroelectric Commission of Ontario, which was the idea, and you'll recognize this because the TVA under the New Deal is a copy paste of what is HEPCO, which is that based on the idea that there would be a state provision of generation and transmission, and that would be provided publicly at cost, right? And so that was the slogan, power at cost. And then they would
It's
provide.
mightily direct.
Yeah, I know. Power at cost. I mean, it was super successful. Power at cost. That's it. Power at cost. And then they would do the generation and the transmission, and then they would deliver that power to municipally owned distribution companies,
Hmm.
right? So that model is the TVA, right? They provide generation and transmission, and then they deliver it to co-ops, right? And so that was the vision, and they had to do it in a democratic way because obviously the people who were providing power at the time were complaining of, we're not going to give up their monopolies easily. So what had to happen was that this commission was created. They had to have individual city by city votes, plebiscites basically, that said,
Hmm.
listen, yes, we want to take this power, And then each of them had to have subsequently in 1908 a series of votes to be able to issue the bonds to be able to actually build the distribution networks. Because at this point, the cities don't have any taxing power, right? And so out of this, you get HEPCO, which is the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. It first does the first transmission from Niagara Falls, which was at the time one of the larger generating stations in the world. It starts to provide power in 1910. It then builds a very large, at the time, an even larger generation station at Niagara Falls. And then it sort of moves forward, and I'll put a pin on there, because what's happening in parallel in the United States is that people like Gifford Pinchot, who is at the time the first commissioner of the Forest Service, and more importantly, the guy I wanted to talk about was William Randall Hurst, right? The newspaper man, Citizen Kane, was also a big believer in public power. And he actually, this is one of the things I was looking into, he ran for mayor of New York in 1905 under his own party called the Municipal Ownership League.
No
Right?
way. That's wild.
And the Municipal Ownership League was, the idea that we should have public power and public utilities in New York. He lost by, the guy who beat him got like 37.7%, and Hurst got 37.2%. So he came very close, right?
That's that's a nice progressive era holdover. Right?
Well, that's exactly.
That's where it starts to span, is that in the US, the progressivism, it either takes the form of municipalization, as you say, or it goes into private regulated monopoly. But Ontario stays public, which is pretty incredible.
Right. Yeah, it stays public. And so there's a push in the United States, there's a pushback from, private enterprise, and the compromise is regulation, as you say, right? So in New York, the Public Service Commission gets established in 1907, right? Not soon after that. But, people who in the United States who continue to believe in public power don't give up. The public power advocates managed to get the sufficient number of votes, of signatures, to put up in the 1922 state election in California Proposition 19, which would have created in California the equivalent of the Hydroelectric Commission of Ontario. It would have.
Wow.
It would have changed the Constitution. It would have put up $500 million bond to actually create this commission that would provide public power at cost. It was defeated, and the people who were lobbying against it were PG&E. And Southern California Edison. Southern California Edison. So it wasn't to be in California. And then the next part is that with this Ontario experiment, as it was called, the companies in the United States wanted to make sure that, these kinds of ideas didn't drift further south. And so there was all kinds of lobbying and studies and reports to try to discredit it. But it was not until FDR, as governor of New York, campaigned on public power, amongst other things, and established the New York Power Authority in 1931. He then runs for president, wins, and establishes the Tennessee Valley Authority based on the Ontario model, and had advisors go to Ontario. One of his big supporters in the Senate, George Norris from Nebraska, was a big fan of the Ontario experiment, and he was one of the co-signers of the act to create the Rural
Electrification Act. Yeah,
that's right, the Rural Electrification Act, which is one of the key acts of the New Deal. And to this day, in Nebraska, which is where Norris is from, is the one state that has 100% public power via its hundreds or so co-ops in Nebraska.
Wow. Yeah, the Rural Electrification Act, Robert Bryce has a great chapter on it in A Question of Power, where he does sort of a rundown. And it sets up tons of co ops, some which still exist. One of the largest ones is in Texas. And I mean,
Right.
this goes to show like how complex the US grid is as both a legal and infrastructural entity, that it has like co-ops that still live on in like RTO areas. It's a very strange system we have over here compared to the remarkably straightforward, with its straightforward slogans, power at cost, Ontario Public Power.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so, that's the kinds of, so like what they call the Ontario experiment gets used by, proponents of public
Mm-hmm.
power, and as a way FDR used to call it benchmark regulation, right? Like
Mm.
where we will like the to show that Americans were overpaying for private power, and as a way to get political buy-in to the idea of regulation, right, including the breaking up of these trusts, starting in 1936, 1937, was to show, look, here's, the benchmark against which we can judge ourselves, and look how, cheaply they're providing power. So the idea that you can't provide lower power, is just not a valid response. It's basically just profits. And so, on the other hand, opponents of it were calling it at the time Sovietized or communistic
Mm-hmm.
approach, because it goes against the very idea of private enterprise.
Right.
And so these debates continue to this day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of public power and the public power movement that exists in the United States, it doesn't really exist in Canada because that's what we have. We've achieved it. It's a
Right.
protection of it rather than a proposal to move towards it. It's the same debate, right? Who should do it? Is this a basic service? And what's the most effective, efficient, reliable, and ultimately politically responsive way to provide what we all consider is a basic public service?
Mm-hmm. So that makes sense to me. I mean, I know FDR had plans to do more public power stuff, but he burnt all of his political capital in his second term on court packing, which not a lot of people liked. So it stopped at the TVA and rural electrification, though he did have a major champion in David Lilienthal, who would go on to do many things.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm interested in is by the time nuclear energy shows up in Canada in the
Mm-hmm.
60s, what does the playing field look like then? It's had this, Ontario's had this public power for a while. It's
Right.
matured
Mm-hmm.
as a political entity. Maybe, I don't know if parts of it have ossified or if there are major fights over nuclear in Canada or what. How does it
Right.
look like when Ontario wants nuclear?
Right. Right. So like the rest of North America, there's this huge growth in electricity, right? And so
Staggering,
staggering.
staggering
Yeah, yeah,
growth.
yeah, yeah. So you're starting with, in the 19 in the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, 50s, you're growing at 10, 12, 15% year over year. I mean, that literally means that you're doubling your grid every 7 or 10 years, right? During the
Amazing.
Second War, the same thing.
Yep.
And then you're going, and so basically by the 40s, we have a situation where HEPCO
Mm-hmm.
is now consolidated and owns all the generation and transmission,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the municipalities have municipalized their distribution company. So we have an integrated 99% publicly owned system in Ontario.
Wow.
Okay,
Wow.
and and the other and so if this system was influential in the 1920s and 30s in the United States, it's also influential in the rest of Canada, the other provinces, right? It was soon based on this benchmark, this example of power at cost, that is the strongest political motivation for other provinces to do the same. And so they slowly, over the sort of the interwar period, go through the same process, and then and that gets consolidated in the 40s and 50s. So like the mega large entities like Hydro-Quebec, right,
Mm-hmm.
which is sells power to New York and Maine and all these provinces, they get formed in that time. So it is not only influential south of the border, it's
Hmm.
also influential east-west across the other
Gotcha.
provinces of Ontario, right? So at this point, when you're going into the 50s and 60s, you're at a situation where across Canada, and again, these are provincial entities, we probably have 95% public power
Wow.
in Canada.
It's literally
All the,
unimaginable to me.
right. It's from, and they're all the same situation. They're all different variations of. It's always public. You have the separate entities. One that does the generation and transmission, and then the other one is the distribution. That's a situation in Ontario. Or you have fully integrated companies like Ontario, like Quebec
Hmm.
Hydro-Quebec, and in British Columbia on the west coast, where you have it integrated, where it's the same company throughout, right? Distribution
Gotcha.
generation, right? But anyway, you're into the 50s and 60s, and you're at 95% public power in Canada at all levels: generation, transmission, and distribution. But what happens in Ontario is that in the 40s and 50s, as a result of this phenomenal growth, we're running out of water, right? We're running out of good stuff. Like, I mean, we
You've
have
sucked as much hydro as you can possibly get out of the
exactly as we
area.
can,
Yeah.
unless it's super far north. And we're doubling the grid. And so we start putting in coal, right?
Right. Makes
In the
sense,
Ford.
right? Because you can have it
In,
on site. It's
right.
plentiful.
Yeah.
I mean, you can build huge
Huge.
generators.
Yeah. 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 And and so we go into coal. And then in the 50s, we start the research process to develop our Canadian-made nuclear technology, which is ultimately called CANDU. As an aside, all of our nuclear reactors are CANDU, they're Canadian technology. They are different than what is made in the United States and what other countries do. I'm not an engineer, but it is pressurized heavy water using natural uranium. So the uranium doesn't have to be enriched. So,
Interesting. Okay.
right?
Oh, and that's why some people criticize Cantus for potentially being dual use, right? Is that why? Or
Well,
no?
it can't be dual use
Okay.
because
It's not
because because
enriched.
it's unenriched. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so the strategic decision was enrichment process is expensive. We don't want to do it in Canada. We don't want to rely on anyone else. And so
Hmm.
we can just mine the uranium. And literally the uranium comes, you mine it, you put it into the pellets, and then it goes into the reactor. There's no
Okay.
enrichment
It's just that pipeline
process.
straight from Saskatchewan all the way
That's
to
right. That's right.
Ontario. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So those are the can do. And ultimately, once it was developed in Canada, we exported it to a bunch of different countries. The same way kind of like a Westinghouse or whatever, or GE
Hmm.
or Toshiba would have done it. Um, but anyway, we start running out of, we're growing, and Ontario Hydro, sorry, HEPCO, at that point starts to think, look, there's no more rivers and there's no more areas that we can do the hydro in. We're growing, we're doubling. We're going to be running out of electricity. In the late 40s, actually, they had to ration electricity because there's just too much growth and there wasn't enough capacity. So looking forward, they start to go into coal and nuclear. And there's a series of kind of like experimental reactors. There's a first one that is like a commercial reactor that goes in at Douglas Point in the 60s, right? So again, and then in, I think it was 1966, they fully commit to a rollout. And they do, and this is in the days when in North America we used to be able to build things fast and
Yeah.
efficiently, right? So they commit in 1966 or 64. They break ground on Pickering in 1966, and they're operational in 71, right?
Wow. That is
5 years.
quick.
Yeah, and then so that's and the way in which the CANDU reactors work is that we don't have single unit plants. They always are built in fours, right? So there's Pickering 1, Pickering 2, Pickering 3, Pickering 4. And they start Pickering 1 in 66, and it gets finished in 71. 72, 73, 74 are the other ones. They all get built in an average of about 5 years.
Wow. So you're building a lot of nuclear even into the first energy crisis of the
Right.
70s.
Right. And then, so that's Pickering. Then comes Bruce. So Pickering is on Lake Ontario, maybe 150, no, maybe 75 kilometers east of where I'm sitting. Bruce is a little further north, and the other one is Darlington, which is again maybe 100 kilometers east of where I'm sitting. And so in the end, they built three. Right, and they built three. The early ones were fast, efficient, on budget. Not so much the last. They were, and then you're getting into the problems, right? You're getting into the problems of nuclear build in North America, right? Like the early ones.
So let me ask you about that because in the US, I was just talking to Rod Adams.
Right.
He did a great explanation of how there were also mechanical things that were going wrong just in terms of nuclear production, in addition to victories of the environmental movement over nuclear in
Hmm.
getting linear no threshold
Right.
instituted. Does
Hmm.
Canada adopt the same framework for radiation, and does that add to costs and complexities, or does something else happen?
Yeah, you know, I suspect. I mean, we also have, a federal nuclear regulator, and the question of whether or not, for example, after 3 Mile Island, things get harder. I'm not sure. That's a question I'd have to take a pass on,
Okay,
whether or
okay.
not it becomes more difficult. What I've learned is that the kind of learning by doing, and even though the reactors are all the same technology, there were different sizes and
Hmm.
different versions of the same kind of basic technology. And the first ones were relatively small. They were like half a gig, right?
Hmm.
But by the end, they were like 800 or 900 megawatts, right? And so as they get built, they're tweaking the technology and making them bigger. And
Yeah.
so they're not all first of a kind, obviously, but they weren't also just replication the way in which it was done in France, for example,
Right. They weren't
where it
just
was
mesmer stamping
they
the
were not
reactors
doing
out.
that. No, no,
Yeah.
they were tweaking it and making them better at the time, and expanding them, making them bigger to try to kind of take advantage of the economies of scale. But the last one comes on board. Darlington comes on board in, I think it was 1993. And in 1993, at that point, you have 20 reactors, and we are at that point probably 75 or 80% nuclear. Ontario
Wow.
is, right?
Wow.
And then, but like in a great episode with Rod Adams, one of the things that happens is that a lot of these decisions get made in the 60s and 70s when we're growing still at 6 or 7 or 8%, but then we get kind of like the recessions associated with the energy crisis of 73, 79. We get a particularly brutal recession in 1990 in Ontario.
So huge
Um,
demand drop.
it's a huge demand drop, and suddenly the idea that you're building pretty lumpy nuclear reactors to be able to provide power for 30 or 40 years, and power that was basically doubling in size every 10 years, growing at 7 or 8%. There were political decisions at the time that they said, listen, because there were plans for more, right?
Hmm.
And they got kiboshed, right?
Hmm.
They were kiboshed because in 1990s, it was a different situation than it is now. There was also a fundamental change in the idea of growth,
Yes, that's
right?
huge. That shift is huge. In America, that really kicks off in the 70s because we have Lovins and Costa and a few other people who, well, Costa less so, he's more of an economist, but Lovins and Ralph Kavanaugh, et cetera, who are like, not buying the growth thing. Even people who would otherwise be smarter about it, like Christopher Lasch, favorite writer of, becomes deeply skeptical of the growth ideology and spends the rest of his career critiquing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Look, I mean, in Ontario, through this time, once you start once you've reached the last farm, the rest of it is, that's extensive. Once you reach the extensive frontier, the rest of it is intensification,
Yeah.
right? And so, just like the utilities in the United States and Canada, part of the idea was to generate consumption, right?
Yeah.
And so they would be, traveling sales and circuses and stuff like that with, with the washing machines in the back and, the electric
Hmm.
ranges and all that kind of stuff to try to kind of generate that, right? But yeah, and so we also have a political change, and which kind of gets to some of the discussions we've been having. All of this process gets approved. All of the political decision making that ultimately has to approve the plans of this publicly owned utility are based on conservative governments, right?
Hmm.
And unlike the United States, where we actually have a conservative party,
Hmm.
and it's called the Conservative Party, and we
Right.
also have a Liberal Party, right? So
Right. Right.
it's very easy to follow. So Ontario, the nuclear rollout occurs under conservative governments,
Hmm.
right? And they are in power most of the 60s and 70s and up to the mid 80s when most of these decisions were taking place. In the late 80s and up to the mid 90s, we go through a process of liberal governments and the third party here, which is called the New Democratic Party, which is a sort of nominally social democratic party,
Hmm.
and they are heavily influenced by Lovins and the
Mm.
idea of the soft energy, much more so than the conservatives, right? And they're the ones who say, so Lovins comes up here and actually meets with this, what is now called the Ontario Hydro. It had changed names. It used to be called the Hydroelectric Commission of Ontario. Now it's called Ontario Hydro. And they meet and they basically say, this growth thing is maybe not such a good thing. And the first thing they do is they cancel further expansions of nuclear,
Hmm.
right?
Always the
So,
first to go.
right, first one, right? And so the idea that you start at parties of the 60s as nuclear neutral or nuclear interested,
Hmm.
by the mid 70s and certainly late 70s, they have taken on the soft energy mantra,
Hmm. Yeah, because
right?
his essay in Foreign Affairs comes out in 76.
Right. Yeah. So at that point, and so it's through that process that you get this both like external constraints as a result of basically a slowing down of the growth, then you get actually negative growth. And so
Hmm.
the idea that you need lots of power to meet demand is no longer like a done deal, right?
No.
Especially when you have to plan it for like 30 or 40 years.
Right, right. Does Lovins convince Ontario that it needs to do a big conservation campaign as well, where they start paying for people's insulation, they
Yes,
start building the assumptions that you can have, because the way utilities often do it is they'll say, we're going to assume everybody's going to use the most consumptive
right.
stuff they can, and
Yep,
Lovins is like, we'll just make that stuff illegal, and then people can only buy the hyper efficient stuff, and then you have to change your numbers. Like
yep.
that's the game he runs all across America.
And he did it here as well,
Yeah.
right? So it's conservation first.
Yes. Yeah. Negawatts is the thing he likes to use.
Negawatts, negawatts.
He also like he said in an interview. I'm excited for the episode Mark Nelson's going to do with Chris on Lovins coming up because I was watching an interview with Lovins where he said something like the rebound effect doesn't need to obtain because you can make something so efficient that if you're going to electrify it, it almost doesn't add demand. And I was like, that's insane.
Right, right.
Okay, so
Yeah,
anyway,
and
enough
so
griping
so
about
anyway,
Lovins.
so yeah. So they're meeting, and he's an unofficial advisor, and so they go through this process. They cancel, plans that were there to even build a fourth, right?
Hmm.
And so, you know, what happens then is, we've talked about the whole liberalization wholesale markets, right? And, first in Chile, then in the UK, you start to privatize and liberalize markets, whereby you break up these vertically integrated monopolies and then you create a wholesale market that is managed by RTOs, right?
Right, right, right.
Uh,
And people can go sit with my interviews with Meredith Engwin and Aidan Swanson for
right.
a deeper look at the RTO structure.
Right. And so what happens is that this craze in the United States and in the UK, it has two components. It has the privatization,
Hmm.
right? That is to say, these are publicly owned entities, and now we're going to privatize them, and we're then going to break them up and
Hmm.
create these RTO equivalent, right?
Hmm.
Unlike the United States, where everything was private, mostly was private anyway, and so then you just had the one single element, which is the breaking up and then creating these wholesale markets. We were not immune to that
Hmm.
whole neoliberal push for privatization and the creation of wholesale markets, and the belief that a clearing wholesale market should be the mechanism via which investment in an basic infrastructure such as electricity, we should rely on the market to do that, even though we had you know 50 years of pretty good experience that wasn't the case, because 50 years before that we had experimented with private markets, at least we had in Canada, and had rejected them. But anyway, these are the political socioeconomic swings
The
that we
ebbs
go
and
through, right?
flows, yeah.
The ebbs and flows. That's exactly it. And so, under a conservative government, they adopt the California approach. That was the leader at the time.
Is that the
And
good old blue book? The blue book
that's
of
right.
regulation that comes out in
That's
the
right.
90s? Yeah.
That's right. The blue book of, yeah, exactly. And they decide to break up Ontario Hydro and start to privatize it. So Ontario Hydro was this vertically integrated generation transmission. They hive off the generation, separated from the transmission, and then create this wholesale market. And this is in 2002. So again, I think New York was the first one to do it in 1996 or 1997. I think New York was the same 2000. And then you get these pushes, including by legislatively by Enron, to get, what was it, 25, maybe 30 of the United States to actually restructure and break up these monopolies and put them into RTO states. And so it was based on that kind of slowed down the whole process, because they wanted to ultimately sell these assets, including the nuclear assets. So that kind of put in the preparation for that and implementation of that process. A lot of these refurbishments didn't take place
Mm.
because it was kind of like 30 years after they had been built, and on average they had to kind of be refurbished every
Every
30
30
years.
years.
It's a little just because of the design, unlike the United States, which is kind of like 40, 45 years.
Sure.
In Canada, they have to be 30 years, or at least they thought it was having to be 30 years. So we lost a lot of nuclear capacity at the point. But then when they were refurbished, it was the manner in which we got off coal, right? Coal had taken a 25 or 30% mix in the generation as a result of these nuclear plants going offline. But then, when there was a political decision to, be one of the first jurisdictions in North America to actually get off coal that had been on coal, 90% of the heavy lifting was done by those nuclear plants that had been idling, right? Because the government had not wanted to commit to
That's
refurbishment.
amazing. So you guys just
They
had these
came on.
plants in the wings, you refurbish them, and then you
Yeah, they
decarbonized.
weren't. Yeah, that's exactly it. They had been turned off. They didn't want to be turned on, and some of them were never turned on. But the ones that were turned on, account for 90%. So so it's not as if new nuclear was the manner in which we got rid of coal. It was the coming back online of a series of reactors that had been kind of mothballed or had not been refurbished as a result of the political and economic uncertainties that led to, this reform process. Once the reform process was done, and ultimately, by the way, rejected because it was the sort of shortest experiment in wholesale markets ever. The government ultimately went back on it about 6 months afterwards. But once that uncertainty was resolved, all of these were refurbished. We're now into the situation afterwards that, we're going to be losing 3 gigawatt of nuclear power, which account for about 21 or 22 terawatt hours. That is, our generation is 150 terawatt hours. So, that's about a sixth of our electricity is generated by Pickering, and they're not going to be refurbished. Part of the reason they're not being refurbished was that, the refurbishment of the existing operators, the existing generation reactors, is very expensive, right? We are now in the process of refurbishing 10 reactors, and staggered. Obviously, we're not taking them off all line at
Right.
the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
time, but it's the largest investment decision in Canada right now, and those 10 reactors will have a cost of $25 billion over about 15 years. That's 20 billion US dollars. So
Hmm.
it's still a large chunk of money.
I'll say.
Yeah, it's a large chunk of money, but what happens is that this third reactor, a set of reactors, didn't make the cut. The decision in 2013 to also be refurbished. Again, the government of the day, given its own fiscal priorities, given not wanting the this OPG to acquire more debt. A
Hmm.
series of fiscal restraints at the time
Yeah.
made it so that they didn't want to refurbish all of them. They only wanted to refurbish the newer ones rather than the older ones.
Right.
On top of which, and this is the other thing that you've heard about from Ontario, is that government of the day was all in on the Canadian or Ontario energy venda,
Hmm.
right? So the political commitment to refurbishment of the nuclear was just not there, or not 100% there, because they were spending billions on wind and solar.
I was about to say, yeah, it's got and a lot of wind, if I remember, gets built
A lot of
out
wind,
in
a lot of wind.
Ontario.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
so it's really a victim of its own present, right? It's right. You have these political concerns that are exist within a certain power dynamic at the time, and that leads to this problem now. And so now it's about, I guess, renegotiating, or what's the plan for saving Pickering now?
right. And so we're going to have there's a so Pickering. So the decision to not refurbish Pickering was a decision by the state-owned enterprise,
Hmm.
OPG, with the non-objection of the government at the time. But ultimately, the discussions that would have taken place would have been similar, like in that context of political and financial constraints, given that we want to favor wind and solar.
Hmm.
Right? We now have a different, political party in power. We're having a provincial election
Mm.
in 5 months' time, and everyone is getting ready to do what is necessary to make sure that the best arguments are put forward for that. If we do not want to go backwards in terms of climate,
Hmm.
that if we do not want these gas powered generators to ramp up to
Hmm.
pick up 23 terawatt hours worth of power, we will not be able to for sure be able to pick that up from wind and solar.
Oh yeah, no way.
The political will to put it this way, one of the first things that this new government, when they got elected 3 years ago, was they repealed the Energiewende Act, right? So
Hmm.
the Energiewende Act, it's called the Green Energy Act, was basically a copy paste of what was happening in Germany.
Right, right.
And the main mechanism that was used, in addition to conservation first, was the feed-in tariffs, which are the equivalent of the net metering, right?
Hmm.
And so it was to promote above wholesale market prices the subsidized entry of wind and solar. Those projects are especially on the wind side, have all kinds of political pushback from rural areas in Ontario.
Mm.
Right? They're the main element for our increases in our prices in Ontario for electricity prices, and the whole pushback on those are related to increases in energy poverty. We had two elections during which electricity was, if not the first, definitely the second policy debate, policy election issue in Ontario. And so the current provincial government comes in and basically kills the Green Energy Act, the Energiewende,
Hmm.
and since then no new renewables have come in. Under that context, it is impossible to think that we would have that more than like 1 or 2 terawatt hours of the 23 that are being taken offline in 2025 would be taken up by wind and solar.
Oh yeah, I mean, as Warren Buffett loves to say, the reason you build a wind turbine is to get the tax credit.
Right.
You know, you don't build it
Right.
for energy. That's not what they're for. They're for
Yeah,
tax
yeah.
credits.
Yeah, and we have, and we don't have that system. We have the system of what they have in Germany, which is, whereby the the developer, gets, 20 cents from the market
I see.
by selling the market, but then there's out of market prices, out of market revenues to the tune of say 80, right?
Okay.
So they're getting most. So it's not a tax credit, rather it's a contract for differences where there's a wholesale market, they sell into the wholesale market at 20, but they get 80 on the side.
Hmm.
Right? And that side is what makes electricity very expensive because it's collected from the rate base, right? But anyway, all to say that, that's not going to happen. And the realistic scenario is that it's going to be gas. And it would be a real pity because we have a very emission grid right now. We're certainly below 100, grams per kilowatt hour. We're probably one of
Mm.
the greenest grid. Anyone checks out, that handy little mobile app on,
Hmm.
electricity grid, we're always one of the cleanest in the world. And
Wow.
that's because we have 60% nuclear, 20% hydro, right,
Hmm.
from historical hydro. We have maybe 10% wind and solar, and then 10% gas, right? But
Hmm.
what would happen is that 10% gas would increase from 10 to maybe 25% if we were to lose that 15% from Pickering.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how do people get involved? How do they find this? Where can you direct them to help out with saving Pickering?
Sure. So there's a couple of groups that are trying to do that, and then there's a couple of Twitter feeds. So there's a Save Pickering site that we'll put in the show notes. There's a Save Pickering Twitter handle that we'll put in the show notes as well, and then we'll put some more things up on the show notes to talk about a bit more about the history of Ontario Hydro, a little bit on the sort of history of the nuclear rollout. Again, it's something that very few people know about, even in Ontario, right? It's one of those
Right.
things, right? It's like we are 60% nuclear, and we have certainly lower rates than our other non-nuclear provinces in Canada, and we have much lower rates than much of the United States, and we have one of the cleanest grid, and that elimination of 25% of our grid that was coal was at the time, and probably to this day, the largest decarbonization initiative in North America. So it was a very, very
Yeah.
significant
It's
reduction.
huge.
Yep,
That's
yep,
huge. Yeah.
yep.
So that's vital. All right, if people, you want to get involved, you want to see what's up, check the show notes. I had a great time. I learned a lot from this. I hope you did too. Edgardo, thanks for coming on. As always, you'll probably be back again, I am sure.
Great. Thank you, Emmett. Hope this was interesting for our American neighbors, and great to be on again on this show. And best of luck on this new adventure. I am totally enjoying your Substack notes. They're great. Your newsletter, and again, I don't think I have to preach the converted here to your listeners, but that sign on to those. Those are great newsletters from Emmett that I look forward to receiving every week.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It means a lot to hear that. All right, everybody. Stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next week.